Okay, let's just dive right into this explainer. Today, we're investigating a genuinely fascinating historical mystery. We're looking at whether one of history's most influential figures was, well, fundamentally misunderstood by the exact same civilization that championed him. We are, of course, talking about the Apostle Paul and the profound question of how his letters have been read over the last 2 millennia.
According to the source material we're digging into today, a really intriguing text called The Paul They Built, the traditional European Christian interpretation of Paul might actually be a massive historical misreading. For centuries, Paul's been viewed as the guy who definitively abolished the Torah, the guy who tossed out the Sabbath and the commandments in favor of a law-free religion. But our source makes a bold argument. This version of Paul, it's a construct, and it totally contradicts the historical record.
To unpack this whole case of the two Pauls, we're going to organize our investigation into 5 quick chapters. 1. A warning inside the canon. 2. The Paul of the record. 3. The recovered idiom. 4. The heretic who won. And 5. Reassessing the proof texts.
Let's start with Chapter 1, a warning inside the canon. We're kicking things off with a strange anomaly right out of the gate, a literal warning from within the canon itself.
What's absolutely fascinating here is the Apostle Peter's precise warning. Writing about his beloved brother Paul, Peter explicitly states that Paul's letters contain things that are, frankly, hard to understand. But more importantly, he warns that these letters are easily twisted or wrested by the unlearned. That is a huge red flag.
So that begs the question, unlearned in what exactly? Well, when Peter wrote those words, the only scriptures that actually existed were the Hebrew texts, the Tanakh, meaning the Torah, the prophets, and the writings. The source suggests that Paul just cannot be safely read by anyone lacking a deep Hebrew foundation. It kind of foreshadows this massive historical experiment. What actually happens when you hand Paul's letters over to Greek philosophers and Latin jurists completely disconnected from those Hebrew scriptures? According to the text, you get a completely wrested Paul.
Okay, Chapter 2, the Paul of the record. Let's check Paul's alibi by looking at his documented conduct in the book of Acts. Before we even touch the disputed verses, the source suggests we look at how the man actually lived. And the sheer accumulation of these acts is striking. The historical record shows a Paul who kept the Sabbath as a fixed habit, a guy who literally hasted to Jerusalem to observe the Torah feast of Pentecost. He took a traditional Nazirite-style vow, and he even personally circumcised Timothy. This behavior, it contrasts sharply with all those later claims that he taught a complete abandonment of Moses. And this is brilliantly illustrated in the canon's own narrative. Paul literally stakes his own body on refuting the rumor that he was anti-Torah. In Acts 21, James tells Paul about a rumor going around that he teaches people to forsake Moses. Now, if Paul really believed the law was abolished, this was his golden moment to just say so, right? Instead, what does he do? He undergoes a rigorous, highly public purification ritual in the temple, specifically to prove that he still walks orderly and keeps the law. Then, later on during his trial before Festus, Paul explicitly denies offending the law of the Jews. Think about the context here. A man facing a potential death sentence before Roman authorities doesn't perjure himself to flatter an audience he fully expects to reject him. This is definitive historical trial testimony. Which brings us to Chapter 3, the recovered idiom. This is the absolute smoking gun of our investigation, and it emerges not from some dusty theological debate, but straight from the desert sand, specifically the 1947 discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. There's a crucial point found in a scroll known as 4QMMT. It contains the exact Hebrew equivalent of the phrase works of the law. Now, this is a phrase Paul uses frequently to say a man is not justified by them. For centuries, people just assumed this meant obeying God's commandments was somehow the enemy of faith. But the Dead Sea Scrolls reveal that in Paul's living first-century idiom, works of the law meant something incredibly specific: formal conversion rituals and strict boundary-marking membership requirements. Putting these two readings side by side reveals a massive delta. You've got the traditional European assumption of general bondage versus the actual first-century reality of community entry requirements. So the crisis Paul was addressing wasn't, hey, should we obey God? It was, must Gentile believers undergo a formal conversion ritual like circumcision just to be allowed through the door? It's kind of like confusing the ticket booth with the actual destination.
When you read his letters with this recovered idiom in mind, sentences like this one in Romans suddenly snap into sharp focus. If Paul's target was strictly the conversion ritual being used as a mandatory entry requirement, his statement that faith actually establishes the law makes perfect, logical sense. It no longer reads like some confusing slip of the pen. Moving right along to Chapter 4, The Heretic Who Won.
If Paul didn't abolish the law, we have to figure out who actually caused this massive theological pivot. Where did the anti-law Paul come from? Well, our source points to a specific date and name. Around 140 CE, a wealthy shipowner named Marcion showed up in Rome, and he taught that the God of the Hebrew Scriptures was an entirely different wrathful deity, alien to Jesus. Marcion created the first Christian canon, but he completely removed the Tanakh, the Old Testament. He only presented heavily edited letters of Paul, effectively cutting out all the Hebrew connective tissue that actually gave Paul's arguments their meaning in the first place.
Now, the early church officially condemned Marcion as a heretic, but the source cites scholar Adolf von Harnack, who observed something totally profound. The heretic lost the vote and won the hermeneutic, meaning even though Marcion was excommunicated, the mainstream church still absorbed his fundamental instinct, this lingering law versus grace mentality that domesticated the God of Sinai and basically reclassified the commandments as bondage.
It is a fascinating historical irony. The earliest Torah-observant communities, groups like the Nazarenes and Ebionites, who actually did exactly what Acts records Paul doing, were systematically suppressed and erased from history. Meanwhile, the mainstream European tradition retained this deeply Marcion-influenced reading of Paul. As the source bluntly notes, the side with the emperors ultimately secured the archive.
Finally, Chapter 5, Reassessing the Proof Texts.
Let's look at how the source material reassesses those famous proof texts historically used to argue Paul abolished the law. Take Galatians 3:24, where the law is called our schoolmaster bringing us to Christ. The original Greek word there is pedagogos. But here's the thing, this wasn't some strict modern schoolmaster or prison warden. In that culture, a pedagogos was a trusted household guardian whose specific job was to safely escort a child to the teacher every single day. Translating this word correctly totally reframes the law. It's not a death sentence you need to escape from. It's a supportive, protective escort bringing you directly to the destination. Or consider the context of Colossians 2:16. An isolated reading assumes Paul is essentially saying, don't let anyone judge you because you stopped keeping the Sabbath, but a contextual reading points out the actual direction of the sentence. Paul is writing to a congregation that is actively observing these Torah elements, food, drink, Sabbaths, and he's telling them not to accept condemnation from ascetic outsiders who are pushing extreme self-abasement. It's a defense of their observance, for sure, not a cancellation of it.
This brings us to a massive structural test, the Deuteronomy 13 measuring line. The book of Deuteronomy explicitly mandates that any prophet or teacher who instructs believers to turn away from Moses' commanded way is, by definition, a false prophet. The logic here is pretty stark. If Paul actually taught the abolition of the commandments, he unequivocally fails this biblical test. Our source notes it's a strange irony that the people most invested in Paul's authority insist on the one interpretation that would biblically disqualify him. Only the Torah-observant reading actually rescues his authority and aligns him with the prophets.
Finally, the text points to Paul's explicit warning in Romans 11 to Gentile believers. He told them they were wild branches grafted into Israel's cultivated tree, giving a direct command: boast not against the branches. And if you do boast, remember, the root supports you, not the other way around. The source argues this imperative was historically completely ignored by later leaders who effectively built a civilization on the exact boasting Paul specifically forbade.
So we'll leave you with this lingering question that Paul himself asks in Romans 11. Hath God cast away his people? Paul's own answer was a resounding God forbid. But as we've seen throughout this explainer, the interpretation of Paul's letters took a wildly different path. It really makes you consider how a 2,000-year-old game of historical telephone, missing context and lost idioms, might have fundamentally reshaped the course of history. I mean, what really happens when we read someone's mail without understanding the language they were speaking? That is a question absolutely worth pondering.